A cold night and a chance encounter. The city streets lay silent under the soft glow of flickering streetlights. Officer Clark steered his patrol car down the dimly lit avenues, the weight of yet another long shift pressing heavily on his shoulders. It had been a quiet night so far. No major calls, no chaotic chases, just the monotony of patrolling streets that felt emptier with each passing year. Clark leaned back in his seat, absently adjusting the rearview mirror. His mind wandered, as it often did during these late-night shifts, to the faces and stories he'd encountered over the years. Some nights, he could still hear the cries of people he couldn't help and the faint echoes of mistakes he couldn't undo. It was part of the job, he told himself. You can't save everyone. As he passed the city park, something unusual caught his attention. On one of the benches near the edge of the playground, a small figure sat huddled under the dim orange glow of a streetlight. Clark slowed his patrol car, narrowing his eyes. It wasn't unusual for teenagers or homeless folks to loiter in the park after dark, but this figure was different. Small, fragile, and oddly still, like a ghost frozen in time. Clark brought the car to a stop and stepped out, the cold night air biting at his face. His boots crunched against the gravel path as he approached the bench. The figure became clearer. A young girl, no older than 8 or 9, curled up on the hard wooden surface. Her thin frame was swallowed by an oversized hoodie, and her legs were tucked tightly against her chest. A well-worn backpack rested at her side, bulging awkwardly with its contents. "Hey, kid," Clark called, his voice a mixture of authority and concern. "You can't be out here like this. It's too cold." The girl stirred, her head lifting slightly. Her dark eyes, wide with fear, locked onto his. She pressed herself against the back of the bench, clutching the hoodie tighter around her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "What's your name?" Clark tried again, softening his tone. He crouched down to meet her eye level, noticing the streaks of dirt smudged across her face and the way her lips trembled, not just from the cold, but from fear. "You don't have to be scared. I just want to help." The girl didn't respond, her gaze darting between him and the shadows behind him. Clark sighed, glancing around the empty park. The city had been dealing with an uptick in runaway cases lately, and this girl fit the profile perfectly. Worn clothes, a stuffed backpack, and eyes that spoke of a world far too heavy for a child her age. "You can't sleep here," he continued gently. "It's not safe. Where are your parents?" At this, her body stiffened. She hugged her niece tighter, shaking her head. "Can't go home," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, don't make me go back." Clark frowned. He wasn't new to these situations. He knew the signs of a child desperate to avoid home. Still, he needed answers. "Why can't you go home?" he pressed, keeping his voice calm. Her lower lip quivered, and for a moment, Clark thought she might burst into tears. Instead, she reached for her backpack and hugged it tightly, as if it were the only thing in the world she could trust. "I can't," she said again, her voice cracking. "Please, don't make me." Clark's chest tightened. He had dealt with a lot of hard cases during his years on the force, but this one felt different. There was something in her voice, a raw, aching pain that made it impossible to dismiss her as just another runaway. "Okay," he said after a long pause. "You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here either. It's freezing out, and it's not safe." He stood up, brushing off his knees. "Come with me. We'll figure something out." The girl hesitated, her grip on the backpack tightening. Her eyes darted to the patrol car, then back to Clark. He could see the conflict written all over her face, fear of the unknown warring with the instinct to survive. "I'm not going to hurt you," Clark said, his voice firm but kind. "I promise. Let's get you somewhere warm, okay?" After what felt like an eternity, the girl nodded. Slowly, she slid off the bench, her small frame shivering in the cold. Clark opened the passenger door for her, and she climbed in cautiously, clutching her backpack like a lifeline. As Clark settled into the driver's seat, he glanced at her through the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her face illuminated by the passing streetlights. She looked so small, so fragile, and yet there was a quiet strength in her posture, an unspoken determination to keep going, no matter how hard things got. "What's your name?" he asked as they drove away from the park. She hesitated, her eyes flickering to him in the mirror. "Amara," she said finally, her voice soft. "Well, Amara," Clark said, his tone lightening slightly. "You hungry?" She nodded, her gaze dropping to her lap. Clark reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a granola bar, handing it back to her. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." "Thank you," she murmured, unwrapping the bar with trembling hands. As she ate in silence, Clark's mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about her earlier words, "I can't go home." The way she said it had sent a chill down his spine, and he knew there was more to her story than she was letting on. "Amara," he said gently, "can you tell me why you're out here all alone?" Her chewing slowed, and she glanced up at him cautiously. I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted after a long pause. "What about your parents?" Clark asked, keeping his tone neutral. "My mom's not around," she said, her voice faltering. "And my dad." She stopped, her words trailing off into silence. Clark didn't press her. He could tell that whatever she was holding back would take time to surface. For now, his priority was getting her somewhere safe. As they approached the station, Clark glanced at her again. She was staring out the window, her expression unreadable. He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning of something much larger. Whatever Amara's story was, he was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant challenging everything he thought he knew about his job and himself. "Don't worry, Amara," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "We'll figure this out, together." The secret she carries. The small interview room at the station was quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Officer Clark sat across from Amara, who was perched on the edge of her chair, clutching her tattered backpack as if it were the only thing anchoring her to this world. Her oversized hoodie swallowed her frame, and her head remained bowed, her eyes fixed on the scuffed floor. Clark leaned back, folding his arms. The warmth of the station hadn't yet reached her. She was still shivering. Whether from the cold or from fear, he wasn't sure. He'd worked with runaways before, but something about this girl felt different, something raw, unspoken. The way she recoiled at every sound, her small hands gripping the edge of her chair, it was a silent scream that Clark couldn't ignore. "Amara," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I need you to tell me what's going on. I know it's hard, but I can't help you if you don't talk to me." Amara's eyes flicked up briefly, meeting his before darting away. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she shifted in her seat, her small frame curling inward. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Clark sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't great at this part, getting people to open up. He had always been the no-nonsense officer, the guy who focused on facts and let others handle the emotional stuff. But tonight, something felt different. He couldn't just file a report and move on. This girl, this scared, trembling child, wasn't just another case. "All right," he said, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Let's start simple. How long have you been out on your own?" Amara hesitated, her fingers tightening around the straps of her backpack. "A few days," she mumbled, barely above a whisper. "A few days," Clark repeated, his brows furrowing. "Where have you been staying?" "Here and there," she replied vaguely, her voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the hum of the lights. "Sometimes under bridges, sometimes in parks." Clark felt a pang of guilt. A child her age, surviving on scraps, sleeping in the cold. How many people had walked past her, turned a blind eye? He glanced at the clock on the wall, its ticking suddenly loud in the silence. He had to tread carefully, pushed too hard, and she'd retreat further into herself. But he needed answers. "Amara," he said gently, "why did you run away? You told me earlier you couldn't go home. Can you tell me why?" Her reaction was immediate. Her body stiffened, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her backpack. Her head shook violently, her lips trembling. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't talk about it." Clark watched her closely, his cop instincts kicking in. This wasn't just a runaway kid angry at her parents for grounding her. There was fear in her eyes, real and palpable. It wasn't just the fear of being caught. It was the fear of something, or someone, lurking in the shadows of her life. "Amara, listen to me," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're safe here. No one can hurt you. Whatever's going on, you don't have to face it alone." For a moment, it seemed like she might speak. Her lips parted, her eyes darting to his, but then she clamped her mouth shut, shaking her head again. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "They don't believe kids like me." Clark's heart twisted. "They don't believe kids like me." He recognized the weight of those words, the bitter truth they carried. The system was broken, and children like Amara often fell through the cracks. He'd seen it too many times. Kids shuffled between indifferent caseworkers, their stories dismissed as exaggerations or lies. But this time, he wasn't going to let that happen. "Amara," he said firmly, "I believe you. Whatever it is you're scared of, I'll listen. No judgment, no assumptions, just the truth." Her shoulders trembled, and a tear slipped down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the sleeve of her hoodie, but the dam had already cracked. She sniffled, her small hands trembling as they fidgeted with the zipper on her backpack. "My uncle," she finally said, her voice barely audible. He's not a good person." Clark's stomach tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a wave of anger coursing through him. "What do you mean, Amara?" he asked gently. "What did your uncle do?" Her breathing hitched, and she shook her head again, her hands covering her face. "He hurts me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "All the time. When he drinks, he gets so angry. He says, I'm the reason everything's bad." Clark's hands clenched into fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms. He forced himself to stay calm, to keep his voice steady. "Did he?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Did he ever hit you?" Amara nodded, her face buried in her hands. "Sometimes," she said, her voice muffled. "Sometimes worse. He locks me in the basement when he doesn't want to see me. Sometimes he forgets I'm there." Her words dissolved into sobs, her small body shaking as years of pain and fear spilled out. Clark's heart shattered. He'd seen a lot in his years on the force. Domestic violence cases, abused kids, families torn apart. But this felt different. Amara wasn't just another statistic. She was a scared, broken child who had been failed by everyone who was supposed to protect her. "Amara," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't deserve any of that. None of it. Do you hear me?" She didn't respond, her sobs quieting to soft sniffles. Clark sat back, running a hand through his hair. He knew he had to report this, had to involve Child Protective Services, but the thought of handing her over to a system that might fail her again made his stomach turn. "Do you have any other family?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Anyone else who can take care of you?" Amara shook her head. "My mom's in jail," she said quietly. "And I don't know my dad. It's just me." Clark leaned back, his jaw tightening. This wasn't going to be easy. The system was stretched thin, and kids like Amara often ended up in foster care, bouncing from home to home. He didn't want that for her, not after everything she'd been through. "Okay," he said finally, his voice firm. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to file a report so we can make sure your uncle can't hurt you anymore. And I'm going to make some calls, find someone who can help you. But I promise, Amara, I won't let you get lost in the system. I'll be here for you." Her eyes lifted to meet his, a glimmer of hope breaking through the shadows. "You promise?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Clark nodded, his throat tightening. "I promise. You're not alone anymore." For the first time since he found her, Amara's lips curved into a faint smile. It was small, tentative, but it was enough to ignite something in Clark, a determination to fight for her, to ensure she got the second chance she deserved. As the night stretched on, Clark stayed by her side, listening to her story piece by piece. With each word, the picture became clearer, a story of pain, neglect, and resilience. And as he listened, Clark felt something stir deep within him. The realization that saving this child might just save a part of himself he thought he'd lost long ago. The fractured path. Amara's trembling hands reached into her tattered backpack. Clark watched as she carefully pulled out a bundle of crumpled papers, folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn thin. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she was handling something fragile. She set the papers on the table, her fingers brushing over them before sliding them toward Clark. "What's this?" he asked, leaning closer. "They're letters," she whispered. "From my mom." Clark's brows furrowed. He picked up the top paper and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was jagged, written in hurried strokes, but it was legible. The words struck him immediately. "Amara, I'm so sorry I can't be there for you right now. You're my brave girl. I promise, when I get out, I'll make things better. Just hold on, baby. I love you always." He glanced at Amara, who was staring at the table again, her small hands twisting the hem of her hoodie. "Your mom wrote these to you?" he asked. She nodded. "She sends them whenever she can. But my uncle hides them from me. I only get them if I find them first." Her voice cracked, and her shoulders hunched further. "She doesn't know how bad it's gotten." Clark felt his chest tighten. He sifted through the other letters, each one filled with similar promises and reassurances. It was clear her mother cared deeply, but her absence had left a void that no words on a page could fill. "Do you believe her?" Clark asked gently. "That she's going to make things better?" Amara hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't know," she admitted. "She always says she will, but she's been gone a long time." Clark leaned back, setting the letters down. He could see the cracks in Amara's hope, the way life had worn her down far too early. Yet there was still a flicker of something, a faint, stubborn belief that things could change. He wasn't sure if it was enough, but it was a start. "Your mom's in prison, right?" he asked carefully. "Do you know why?" Amara nodded slowly, her fingers fidgeting with the straps of her backpack again. She got in trouble for stealing. She said it was for me. For food. But," her voice trailed off, and she shrugged. "I don't know." Clark's jaw tightened. He had seen stories like this before. Single parents pushed to desperate measures, caught in a system that offered no safety net. He wanted to tell Amara that her mom's intentions mattered, that trying to care for her daughter was noble in its own way, but he wasn't sure it would help. Instead, he reached across the table, resting his hand near hers without touching it. "Amara, what your mom did doesn't mean she doesn't love you. Sometimes, people make bad choices when they're scared or desperate. But it sounds like she's trying to make it right." Amara's eyes flicked to his hand, then to his face. She didn't say anything, but the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. The door to the room creaked open, and a young officer poked his head inside. "Clark, can I have a word?" Clark glanced at Amara, then back at the officer. "Give me a minute." The officer hesitated, then nodded and stepped out. Clark turned his attention back to Amara. "Stay here, okay? I'll be right back." She nodded, her hands gripping her backpack again, as he stood and stepped into the hallway. The younger officer, Diaz, was waiting for him, his expression uneasy. "What's up?" Clark asked. "We ran a quick check on the uncle's address," Diaz said, lowering his voice. There's been a few complaints filed against him. Domestic disturbances, noise violations. Nothing that ever stuck, though. No charges. Clark's jaw clenched. It wasn't surprising, but it still made his blood boil. Anything else? Yeah, Diaz continued. CPS has been involved once before. A neighbor reported seeing bruises on Amara a few years back. Caseworker investigated, but the uncle claimed she got hurt playing outside. No follow-up after that. Clark exhaled sharply, his hands balling into fists. This guy's been hurting her for years, and no one's done a damn thing about it. Diaz nodded grimly. What's the plan? Clark rubbed the back of his neck, his mind racing. We file the report and contact CPS again, but I'm not letting this slip through the cracks this time. This kid deserves better. Diaz gave him a nod of approval before heading back to his desk. Clark lingered in the hallway, his thoughts churning. He'd seen so many cases like this, kids slipping through the system, left to fend for themselves in a world that didn't care. But this time, he wasn't going to let that happen. Not to Amara. When Clark returned to the room, Amara was sitting exactly as he'd left her, her backpack clutched tightly in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wary but less guarded than before. Amara, he said, sitting down across from her again, I need to ask you something important. Your uncle, does he know you're gone? She shook her head quickly. No. He doesn't care when I leave. Sometimes I'm gone for days, and he doesn't even notice. Clark's stomach churned. The thought of a child being so invisible, so forgotten, made his blood boil. What about school? He asked. Do you go to school? Amara hesitated, then nodded. Sometimes, but only when I can. If I don't have bruises or... She trailed off, her voice faltering. Clark leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table. Amara, you've been through so much, more than any kid should have to. But you're safe now. No one's going to hurt you here. She nodded, but the doubt in her eyes remained. Trust wasn't something that came easily for her. It had been broken too many times. We're going to figure this out, Clark said firmly. But I need you to keep being brave, okay? You've made it this far, and that tells me you're stronger than you think. For the first time, Amara's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. It was small, tentative, but it was a start. Clark felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could help her find a way out of the darkness. But deep down, he knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. The fragile road to trust. The early morning light streamed through the station windows, casting pale streaks on the gray walls of the interview room. Amara sat huddled in her chair, her chin resting on her knees, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized hoodie she wore. Officer Clark leaned against the table, his coffee untouched, his eyes fixed on the young girl who had already revealed more pain in one night than most could handle in a lifetime. For hours, Clark had stayed with her, coaxing out fragments of her story. Each piece was like a jagged shard of glass, sharp and painful, yet incomplete. She had survived years of neglect and abuse, hidden in plain sight by a system too broken to notice. And now, as she sat before him, her exhaustion visible in every movement, Clark felt the weight of her survival pressing heavily on him. "Did you get any sleep at all?" he asked, his voice soft but tinged with concern. Amara shrugged, her eyes downcast. "I don't really sleep much," she mumbled. "Too many bad dreams." Clark nodded, understanding all too well what it meant to be haunted by the past. He pulled his chair closer and sat down, resting his elbows on the table. "We'll work on that," he said, "one step at a time." Amara gave a small nod but said nothing. Her silence was different now, not the guarded, fearful quiet of before, but something more resigned, as if she were too tired to hold up the walls she had built. Clark reached for a notepad and pen, flipping to a clean page. "Amara, I need to ask you a few more questions. Some of them might be hard, but I need to know as much as I can to help you. Can you do that?" She hesitated, then nodded again. Her hands clutched the hem of her hoodie, her fingers twisting the fabric nervously. Okay, Clark began, keeping his tone steady. You said your uncle hurts you. Can you tell me how often? Amara shifted uncomfortably, her gaze fixed on the table. A lot, she whispered. Sometimes, every day. Sometimes not for a while. But when he drinks, it's worse. Clark's pen hovered over the page, his jaw tightening. What about school? Do your teachers know? Her head shook quickly. I don't tell them. He says if I tell anyone, they'll take me away, and I'll never see my mom again. Clark exhaled slowly, his grip on the pen tightening. He had heard it before. The threats, the manipulation. Abusers always found ways to silence their victims, to make them feel trapped. But what struck him most was the fear in Amara's voice, the way she clung to the hope of seeing her mother again despite everything. Amara, he said gently, no one's going to take you away from the people who love you. We're going to make sure you're safe first. That's the most important thing. She looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and yearning. You promise? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clark hesitated. He wanted to promise her the world, to assure her that everything would be okay. But he knew better than to make promises he couldn't keep. I promise to do everything I can, he said finally. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Later that morning, Clark met with Diaz and Captain Brennan in the briefing room. The sun was fully up now, the golden light doing little to brighten the heavy mood. Diaz had brought the file on Amara's uncle, a thin folder that spoke volumes about how little had been done to protect her. We've got complaints from neighbors, reports of loud arguments, and one CPS visit that went nowhere, Diaz explained, flipping through the pages. No arrests, no charges. The guy's a ghost on paper. Clark leaned forward, his arms resting on the table. And yet, we got a kid with bruises, malnutrition, and a story that lines up with everything in that file. This guy's not a ghost. He's a predator. Captain Brennan sighed, rubbing his temples. Clark, I get it. But you know how this works. We can't move on just her word alone. CPS has to open a case, and that takes time. Without solid evidence. She is the evidence, Clark interrupted, his voice rising. Look at her. Look at what she's been through. You're telling me we're just going to wait until he does worse? Brennan gave him a hard look. I'm telling you to follow procedure. You think I don't care about that kid. I do. But if we don't handle this the right way, he could walk. And then what? Clark clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling over. And what happens to her in the meantime? She goes into foster care. Back to him. We can't let that happen. Diaz cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. What about her mom? He suggested. If she's in jail, maybe she'd want to talk. If we can prove she's trying to protect her kid, that might help CPS fast-track her case. Clark considered the idea, nodding slowly. It's a long shot, but it's worth trying. That afternoon, Clark sat across from Amara in the station's small break room. She was eating a peanut butter sandwich Diaz had made for her tiny hands gripping the edges of the bread. She looked more relaxed than she had the night before, but there was still a heaviness in her posture, a weight she couldn't shake. Amara, Clark began carefully, we're going to try to talk to your mom. See if she can help us make sure you're safe. Amara froze mid-bite, her eyes widening. My mom. Yeah, Clark said. We think she might be able to give us some information that could help. But I need you to be honest with me, okay? Does she know about what's been happening with your uncle? Amara swallowed hard, setting the sandwich down. I don't know. I wanted to tell her, but he always listens to my phone calls. I couldn't risk it. Clark nodded, his respect for her growing with every word. Despite everything, she had been trying to protect herself and her mother in the only ways she knew how. You did the best you could, he said. Now it's our turn to help. For the first time, Amara smiled, a small tentative curve of her lips that made Clark's chest ache. He had seen so much pain in her, but now, for a fleeting moment, there was hope. By evening, Clark had arranged a call with Amara's mother. He sat in his office, the phone pressed to his ear as the automated system connected him to the prison's communication line. Amara sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. When her mother's voice came through, raw and strained, Amara's head shot up. "Hello," her mom said, the faint crackle of the line adding a layer of distance to her words. "Ms. Jenkins, this is Officer Clark with the city police." Clark began. "I'm here with your daughter, Amara. She's safe, but we need to talk." "What happened?" Her mom's voice sharpened, panic seeping through the static. "Is she okay? Did he?" "She's okay for now," Clark interrupted, glancing at Amara. "But we need to discuss her situation. Your brother, her uncle, has been hurting her." The silence that followed was deafening. Then her mom's voice came back, trembling with fury. "I knew it," she whispered. "I tried to warn them, but no one listened. I told CPS he wasn't safe, but they said there wasn't enough proof." Clark felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. "We're going to change that," he said firmly. "But we need your help." For the next hour, the three of them talked. Clark, Amara, and her mother, piecing together the broken shards of their lives. And as the conversation unfolded, Clark realized something he hadn't expected. This wasn't just about saving Amara. It was about giving her, and her mother, a chance to rebuild, to heal, to find a way forward. And he wasn't going to stop until they got it. A mother's plea. The dull hum of the prison phone line filled the room as Clark leaned forward in his chair, the receiver pressed firmly to his ear. Across from him, Amara sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her wide eyes fixed on the phone, her body tense. On the other end of the line, her mother's voice cracked under the weight of guilt and desperation. "Officer," her mother, Sheila Jenkins, began, her words trembling. "I've been trying to protect her from here, but there's only so much I can do. I knew my brother wasn't fit to take care of her, but when they took me away, there wasn't anyone else. They said he was the only option." Clark clenched his jaw, frustration boiling under his skin. He had heard the excuses from overworked social workers and overstretched systems too many times. Only option was bureaucratic code for "we had no better ideas." And now, Amara had paid the price. "Sheila," Clark said, his voice steady but firm, "Amara has told me some of what's been going on. The bruises, the neglect. It's clear your brother has been hurting her. We're working to make sure she doesn't go back there, but I need your help. Can you tell me anything at all, that might speed this process up?" On the other end of the line, Sheila let out a shaky breath. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, her voice cracking. "When I got locked up, I begged them not to send her to him. I told them he drank too much, that he had a temper. But they didn't listen. They said they'd monitor the situation." Her voice broke into a bitter laugh. "Some monitoring." Clark's pen hovered over his notepad, ready to jot down anything useful. "What do you know about his behavior?" he pressed. Anything that could corroborate Amara's story. Sheila hesitated, and Clark could hear her struggling to gather her thoughts. "He was always mean," she said finally. "Even before this. When we were kids, he used to." She trailed off, and the silence on the line was heavy with unspoken memories. "But with Amara, it's worse. I think he blames her for everything. For me getting locked up, for his own problems." Clark's chest tightened. The image of Amara sitting on that park bench, clutching her backpack like it was her last lifeline, flashed in his mind. "Blames her?" he echoed. "What does that mean?" "He drinks," Sheila said, her voice low and bitter. "And when he drinks, he gets angry. He says things he shouldn't. He used to call her a burden, say she ruined his life. I tried to get her out of there. I even told my caseworker, but they just kept saying there wasn't enough to prove neglect." Clark scribbled down notes, his jaw tightening with every word. "And the bruises?" he asked. Do you think he was hitting her? Sheila's voice dropped to a whisper. I know he was. She told me once, during a visit, but she made me promise not to tell anyone. She was so scared they'd take her even further away from me. As the conversation continued, Clark could feel his frustration mounting. The system had failed Amara at every turn, leaving her trapped in a nightmare she didn't deserve. But now, with Sheila's testimony and Amara's own words, he finally had enough to act. Sheila, he said, his tone softening, I need you to know something. Amara's strong, but she's also just a kid. She needs you to fight for her, even from where you are. Sheila let out a ragged breath. I'm trying, she said, her voice breaking. But what can I do from here? I'm stuck in this place, and she's out there. You can help by talking to the caseworker, telling them everything you've told me, Clark said. And I'll do my part too. We're going to make sure she doesn't go back to your brother. You have my word. There was a long silence on the line, broken only by the faint sound of Sheila's breathing. Thank you, she said finally. Thank you for taking care of her. Clark glanced at Amara, who was watching him intently. She's not just a case to me, he said quietly. She's a person, and she deserves better. After the call ended, Clark sat back in his chair, running a hand over his face. Amara looked at him expectantly, her small frame still tense, as though bracing herself for bad news. What did she say? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. She told me a lot of things, he said carefully. She's worried about you, Amara. She wants you to know she loves you. Amara's lips quivered, and she quickly looked away, blinking back tears. Did she say when she's coming home? She asked. Clark hesitated. Not yet, he admitted. But she's going to help us make sure you're safe in the meantime. We're working on it, okay? Amara nodded, her gaze dropping to her lap. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue either. Later that day, Clark met with Diaz in the squad room to plan their next steps. Amara sat nearby, drawing quietly with a pencil and scrap paper Diaz had given her. She seemed calmer now, but Clark knew it was only a matter of time before her trust was tested again. CPS is sending someone to interview her this afternoon, Diaz said, flipping through a clipboard. They're also going to look into the uncle's background again. But you know how slow this process can be. Clark frowned. It's not fast enough, he muttered. Every minute she's not officially protected is a minute he could try to get her back. Diaz gave him a sympathetic look. You're doing all you can, man. More than most. Not enough, Clark said, shaking his head. He glanced over at Amara, her small figure hunched over the table as she sketched. I made her a promise. I'm not letting her down. That evening, Clark drove Amara to a temporary foster home arranged by CPS. The ride was quiet, the air in the car heavy with unspoken fears. When they arrived, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted them at the door. This is Mrs. Reynolds, Clark explained to Amara. She's going to take care of you for a little while, just until we can figure everything out. Amara clutched her backpack tightly, her eyes darting nervously between Clark and Mrs. Reynolds. You're not leaving, are you? She asked, her voice trembling. Clark knelt down to her level, his expression serious. I'm not going anywhere, he promised. I'll check in on you every day, okay? And I'll keep working on your case. You're not alone in this. She nodded slowly, her grip on the backpack loosening just a little. Okay, she said, though her voice was still hesitant. As Clark watched her walk into the house, a pang of guilt twisted in his chest. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, but as he climbed back into his car and started the engine, he made a silent vow. He wouldn't stop fighting for her, no matter what it took. A glimpse of safety. As Clark drove back to the station after leaving Amara with Mrs. Reynolds, his thoughts churned. The temporary foster placement was a step forward, but it wasn't a solution. Too many times, He'd seen kids shuffled between homes, their lives disrupted again and again. Amara deserved stability, not just temporary shelter. When he pulled into the station's parking lot, the evening sky was streaked with shades of orange and pink. Clark sat in his car for a moment, staring at the dashboard. The conversation with Sheila Jenkins replayed in his mind, her voice cracking as she spoke of her regrets and fears. She had tried to warn the system, but no one had listened. Now, Clark had to make sure her warnings wouldn't be ignored again. Inside the station, Officer Diaz was waiting at Clark's desk, a manila folder in hand. "Got some updates," Diaz said, handing it over. "CPS is officially opening a new investigation into the uncle. Based on your report and the notes from the social worker's visit, they're taking this seriously." Clark opened the folder, scanning the contents. "What about Amara's mother? Did you dig up anything on her case?" Diaz nodded. "Sheila Jenkins has been in for 2 years on a petty theft charge. It looks like she was trying to get food and supplies for Amara. Nothing violent, no priors. With good behavior, she could be eligible for early release in a few months." Clark's jaw tightened. A few months might as well be a lifetime for Amara. That girl's been through enough. Diaz shrugged. "The system moves slow, man. You know that. But CPS is fast-tracking the case because of the bruises and your testimony. They'll prioritize her safety." Clark's eyes narrowed. "Prioritize her safety. That's what they said before. And look where it got her. No, we need to push harder." Diaz raised an eyebrow. "You've got a plan." Clark set the folder down, his mind already racing. "I'm going to visit Sheila in person. If she's serious about protecting her daughter, she'll help us build a stronger case. Maybe we can leverage her cooperation to get something done faster." A mother's hope. The next morning, Clark drove to the state penitentiary where Sheila Jenkins was being held. The facility loomed ahead, its gray walls cold and foreboding. As he checked in at the visitor's desk, he felt a surge of determination. Sheila might have made mistakes, but she was a mother fighting to protect her child. That alone was worth hearing her out. Sheila was brought into the visitor's room, her wrists cuffed and her posture tense. She was a small woman, her face worn with worry and exhaustion. But when she saw Clark, her eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. "Officer Clark," she said, her voice tentative. "Thank you for coming." Clark nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "Sheila, I want to talk more about Amara. We're making progress, but we need to build a stronger case against your brother. Anything you can give us, details, incidents, anything, could help." Sheila clasped her hands together, her knuckles turning white. "I told you on the phone. I tried to warn them. He's always been like this, controlling, angry. When I was younger, he hurt me too. But back then, no one cared. They just said boys would be boys." Clark's stomach churned. He kept his expression neutral, nodding for her to continue. "When I had Amara, I thought I could keep her safe," Sheila said, her voice breaking. "But when I got arrested, everything fell apart. I told the caseworker he wasn't fit to take care of her, but they said there wasn't anyone else. I begged them to check on her, but they only came once, and he made everything look fine." Tears welled up in Sheila's eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. "She's a good kid, officer. She doesn't deserve this. Please, tell me she's okay." "She's safe," Clark assured her. "She's with a foster family right now, but it's temporary. We're working on making sure she doesn't have to go back to your brother." Sheila exhaled shakily, relief flooding her features. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing her." Clark leaned forward. "Sheila, if you're willing to testify against your brother, it could help speed things up. CPS needs all the evidence they can get to make sure he doesn't get custody again." Sheila hesitated, her fingers twisting together. "If it means keeping her safe, I'll do whatever it takes." Back at the station. When Clark returned to the station, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Sheila's testimony was another piece of the puzzle, and he was determined to make it count. He spent the next few hours compiling the evidence, Amara's bruises, her account of the abuse, Sheila's warnings, and the complaints from neighbors. By the time he was done, the file was thick, a damning indictment of the system's failure to protect Amara. As he finished, Diaz walked over, holding a cup of coffee. "You've been at this nonstop," he said. "You sure you're okay?" Clark glanced up, his eyes tired but resolute. "I'm fine. I need to make this right." Diaz nodded, sitting down across from him. "You care about this kid, don't you?" Clark didn't answer right away. He thought of Amara, her small frame hunched in his car, her voice trembling as she told him about her uncle. He thought of the letters from her mother, promises written on crumpled paper. And he thought of himself, years ago, a scared boy who had once felt just as invisible. "Yeah," he said finally, "I care, and I'm not letting her down." The call that changed everything. Later that evening, as Clark prepared to leave for the day, his desk phone rang. He answered it quickly, his heart racing when he heard the voice on the other end. "Officer Clark, this is Mary Ann Jenkins with CPS." The woman said, "We've reviewed the evidence you provided, and we're moving forward with an emergency hearing to terminate the uncle's custody. I wanted to let you know we're also looking into expedited options for Sheila Jenkins's early release." Clark sat back in his chair, relief washing over him. "That's the best news I've heard all week." Marian hesitated. "It's a step in the right direction, but there's still a long way to go. I wanted to thank you for your persistence. Without your involvement, this case might not have moved so quickly." Clark hung up the phone, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't over, but it was progress. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the system might actually work. Not perfectly, but enough to give Amara a fighting chance. As he walked out of the station into the crisp night air, he glanced up at the stars, their light cutting through the darkness. For Amara, the road ahead would still be hard, but she wasn't alone anymore. And as long as Clark had anything to say about it, she never would be again. The emergency hearing. The morning of the emergency custody hearing dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the tense atmosphere Clark felt as he prepared to accompany Amara to court. He had spent the night poring over case files, his mind replaying every detail of her story. It wasn't enough just to believe her. He had to convince the system to act decisively. When Clark arrived at Mrs. Reynolds' home to pick up Amara, she greeted him at the door with her small backpack slung over one shoulder. Her face lit up slightly when she saw him, but there was an uneasiness in her eyes that Clark couldn't ignore. "Hey, Amara," he said, crouching down to meet her gaze. "You ready for today?" She nodded hesitantly, clutching the straps of her backpack. "Do I have to talk?" she asked softly. Clark paused. He had been dreading this question. "Not unless you want to," he assured her. "But if the judge asks, just tell the truth. You're braver than you think." She gave a small nod, though her grip on the backpack tightened. Mrs. Reynolds, standing nearby, placed a reassuring hand on Amara's shoulder. "She's been nervous all morning," Mrs. Reynolds said quietly, "but I think she'll be okay with you there." Clark gave Amara a small smile. "We'll get through this together," he promised. Entering the courtroom. The courthouse was bustling with activity as Clark and Amara arrived. Lawyers hurried through the hallways, their arms full of paperwork, while families gathered in hushed clusters. Clark kept a steady hand on Amara's shoulder, guiding her through the chaos. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavier. The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, sat at the front, presiding over the proceedings with an air of authority. To one side, Amara's uncle sat stiffly, his face pale and drawn. Clark noted the way his hands clenched the edge of the table, his eyes avoiding Amara's completely. Amara shrank back slightly when she saw him, and Clark crouched beside her. "Remember," he whispered, "he can't hurt you anymore. You're safe here." She nodded, though her small hands trembled as she clutched her backpack. Clark guided her to a seat near the CPS representative, Marianne Jenkins, who gave them both a reassuring smile. "Good morning, Officer Clark," she said quietly. "Amara, it's good to see you again." Amara offered a faint smile, but said nothing. Clark gave Marianne a nod before turning his attention to the proceedings. The case unfolds. The CPS attorney began by presenting the evidence Clark had worked so hard to compile. Photos of Amara's bruises, notes from Sheila Jenkins, and the complaints from neighbors were laid out methodically. Clark watched the judge's expression, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. To his relief, she appeared focused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she flipped through the documents. Next, Marianne took the stand, outlining the failures of the previous investigation and detailing the urgency of removing Amara from her uncle's custody. She spoke calmly but passionately, emphasizing the need for immediate action. When it was Clark's turn, he felt a familiar knot of nerves in his stomach. He wasn't used to being on this side of the courtroom, but he knew how important his testimony was. "Officer Clark," the CPS attorney began, "you were the one who initially found Amara. Can you describe the circumstances?" Clark nodded, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I found her sleeping on a park bench late at night. She was cold, scared, and visibly malnourished. When I questioned her, she revealed that her uncle had been physically abusive and neglectful." "And did you observe any injuries at the time?" the attorney asked. "Yes," Clark replied. "She had bruises on her arms and was visibly underweight. She also expressed fear of returning to her uncle's home." The attorney nodded, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, we believe this evidence, combined with Ms. Jenkins' testimony, clearly demonstrates that Amara's current guardian is unfit and that immediate removal is necessary." A turning point. When it was the uncle's turn to speak, his demeanor shifted. He sat up straighter, his voice defensive but calculated. "She's exaggerating," he said, his tone clipped. "Kids get bruises. She's a clumsy girl, always falling and getting into trouble. And as for the food, I work long hours. I can't always keep an eye on her." Clark felt his fists clench at his sides, but he forced himself to remain calm. He glanced at Amara, who was staring at the floor, her hands trembling. "Mr. Jenkins," the judge said sharply, "the evidence suggests a pattern of neglect and abuse. Do you have any explanation for the complaints filed against you by neighbors?" "They don't like me," he said with a dismissive shrug. "They're just nosy. They don't know anything about how I take care of her." The judge's expression hardened. "Care of a child is not optional, Mr. Jenkins. This court takes these allegations very seriously." Amara's moment. Toward the end of the hearing, the judge turned to Amara. "Miss Jenkins," she said gently, "I understand this is difficult, but I want to hear from you. Can you tell me, in your own words, how you've been treated by your uncle?" Clark felt Amara stiffen beside him. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he whispered. "Just tell the truth." Amara hesitated, her voice barely audible when she finally spoke. He hurts me," she said, her words trembling. "When he's mad, he hits me. And sometimes he doesn't let me eat." The judge leaned forward, her expression softening. "Thank you, Amara. That was very brave of you." Amara's eyes filled with tears, but she sat up a little straighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The decision. After a tense deliberation, the judge delivered her verdict. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that Mr. Jenkins is unfit to serve as a guardian. Custody of Amara Jenkins is hereby revoked, and she will remain in the care of Child Protective Services until a suitable long-term arrangement can be made. A wave of relief washed over Clark. He glanced at Amara, who looked at him with wide, tearful eyes. "Does this mean I don't have to go back?" she asked, her voice trembling. Clark nodded, his own eyes damp. "You're safe now, Amara. You don't ever have to go back." After the hearing, outside the courthouse, Amara stood quietly beside Clark, the crisp autumn air brushing against her face. For the first time since he'd met her, she seemed lighter, as if a shadow had finally lifted. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up at him. "For everything." Clark knelt down, meeting her gaze. "You don't have to thank me, Amara. You did this. You were brave, and you told the truth. That's what matters." As they walked to the car, Amara slipped her hand into his. It was a small gesture, but to Clark, it spoke volumes. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd made a real difference, not just as a cop, but as a person. And he knew that this was just the beginning of Amara's journey to healing. A new chapter. The weeks following the emergency hearing were a whirlwind of changes for Amara. The weight of fear that had hung over her for so long had begun to lift, though the scars, both seen and unseen, remained. For Officer Clark, however, the end of the hearing wasn't an end at all. It was a beginning. Clark visited Amara every day at Mrs. Reynolds' house, making good on his promise to never leave her to navigate this alone. Each visit revealed more of her spirit, a quiet resilience that amazed him. Slowly, she began to trust not just him, but the possibility of a future where she could feel safe. The road to healing. One sunny afternoon, Clark arrived at Mrs. Reynolds' house with a bag of art supplies. He had noticed how much Amara loved to draw during her time at the station, using scrap paper and borrowed pencils to sketch simple but striking pictures. Today, he wanted to give her something more permanent. As he stepped through the front door, Amara ran to greet him, her face lighting up with a shy smile. She was still cautious around most adults, but Clark had earned a place in her small circle of trust. "Hey, Amara," Clark said, kneeling to her level. "I brought you something." Her eyes widened as he handed her the bag. She peeked inside, her face breaking into the closest thing to pure joy he'd seen from her yet. "Paints and sketchbooks?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. Clark chuckled. "I thought you could use something a little better than scrap paper." Amara hugged the bag tightly, then looked up at him. "Thank you," she whispered. "Wanna try them out?" he asked. Amara nodded enthusiastically, and they set up a makeshift art station at the kitchen table. As she painted, her movements became more confident, her strokes bolder. Clark watched her, marveling at the way her expression shifted, focused, determined, and for the first time, unburdened. "What are you working on?" he asked after a while. She held up the paper shyly. It was a sketch of a park bench, surrounded by flowers. Above it, a bright sun shone in a blue sky. "It's where you found me," she explained. "But better." Clark felt a lump form in his throat. The image was simple, yet powerful, a reflection of her hope, her way of reimagining a moment of despair into something beautiful. "It's perfect," he said softly. The push for permanent change. While Amara began to settle into her new life, Clark worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure her safety would last. Sheila Jenkins' early release was still under review, but Clark wasn't willing to wait passively. He visited the prison again, sitting down with Sheila to discuss what Amara's future could look like. "Sheila," he said during one visit, "I need you to know that Amara still believes in you. She's holding on to the hope that you'll be there for her." Sheila's face crumpled with emotion. "I want to be," she said, her voice thick. "I've made mistakes, but everything I did was for her. I didn't know how to fix it." "You're going to have to prove it," Clark said gently but firmly. "The system's going to watch you closely when you're out. You need to show them, and Amara, that you're ready to be the mother she needs." Sheila nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes." Clark left the prison that day feeling hopeful. Sheila had a long road ahead of her, but her love for Amara was clear. It was the kind of love that, if nurtured, could help them both heal. A small victory. A month after the hearing, Clark received a call from Mary Ann Jenkins at CPS. Sheila's early release had been approved, contingent on her participation in a reintegration program and regular check-ins with social services. Clark immediately drove to Mrs. Reynolds' house to share the news with Amara. She was sitting on the porch, painting a new piece, a bright field of wildflowers. "Amara," Clark said as he approached, I've got some good news." She looked up, her brush pausing mid-stroke. "What is it?" "Your mom's getting out soon," he said, his voice careful but warm. "She's going to work really hard to make things better, and CPS is going to help make sure you're both okay." Amara's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of fear or sadness. She set her brush down and hugged Clark tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. A reunion. The day Sheila was released was bright and clear, the crispness of early winter in the air. Clark accompanied Amara to the small meeting room at the reintegration center where Sheila waited nervously. She looked different, more grounded, less burdened by the weight of her mistakes. When Amara stepped into the room, she froze for a moment, her wide eyes locking on her mother. Then, without hesitation, she ran into Sheila's arms. "Mom," she cried, her voice breaking. Sheila clung to her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "I missed you so much, baby," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." Clark stood back, giving them their moment. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction watching them reconnect, knowing that he had played a part in giving them this chance. Building a future. In the weeks that followed, Sheila and Amara worked with social workers to establish a stable home. Sheila found a job through the reintegration program, and Amara continued to stay with Mrs. Reynolds, while her mother got back on her feet. Clark checked in regularly, making sure they had everything they needed. He and Amara developed a bond that went beyond their initial meeting. He had become her protector, her confidant, and in many ways, the father figure she had never known. One evening, as Clark sat with Amara and Sheila at their small apartment, Amara brought out her latest painting. It was a portrait of the three of them, standing together in a bright field of wildflowers. "This is how I see us now," Amara said shyly, handing it to Clark. Clark looked at the painting, his chest tightening. It was simple but full of meaning, a testament to the bond they had forged and the hope that had replaced despair. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like you." Moving forward. Though their journey wasn't over, Clark knew Amara and Sheila had something they hadn't had in a long time. A chance, and as he drove home that night, he realized that they had given him something too. A reminder of why he had chosen this path, and a sense of purpose that he thought he had lost. Amara's story wasn't just about survival. It was about resilience, love, and the power of one person believing in another. And for Clark, it was a story he would carry with him forever.